Welcome and thanks for joining me. I want to start by telling you a story of three small fluffs. So Bob was the oldest fluff, he was a senior gentleman and he was aged 13 years. Bob was never involved in any of the fighting, but it is important that he gets a mention. Rita was a younger fluff, she was aged 9, and Sue was the youngest, she was aged 8. When their guardian got in touch with me some 7 years ago, Rita and Sue had been fighting since Sue was adopted some 6 years before that. There were low-level squabbles at least 2 or 3 times every single day, and periodically the dogs would have such a severe fight that one or the other would end in a vet surgery. Ears had to be removed, one of the pair had lost an eye, they frequently injured each other so severely that one or the other needed stitches. Rita and Sue fought so frequently that it was kind of hard to identify any patterns. They were generally okay around food, though there would sometimes be a skirmish if Sue finished her food first and went to investigate Rita's bowl while Rita was still eating. Rita and Sue's guardians, Fiona and John, they usually fed them separately. However, Rita and Sue would often start a fight if they were waiting for breakfast or they were waiting for dinner as well. And they'd often fight if Rita was sitting with Fiona and Sue came over for some affection as well. Rita and Sue would also fight on walks if anybody approached them and leant down to pay attention to them, and when guests arrived, all hell would break loose if the girls weren't separated, and it had got to the point where one or the other had to be kept crated. They'd try to fight as well through the barriers, and so their crates had to be kept on different sides of the room. Fights would also happen if Fiona arrived home and the dogs had been alone with John, so they'd jump off the sofa where they'd been with John and they'd run over to the door and then start a scrap. As soon as they heard the car pulling in, they'd just make a beeline for each other and get into a fight. I often ask my clients what's prompted them to call me, since there will usually be a tipping point moment where the guardians have become so frustrated and so upset with the situation that they say no more, and often it will be that one first fight. When there's been a very long history of fights, clients have sometimes put up with things. Fiona and John have put up with things for 6 years, thinking that there's no solution, or not knowing how to deal with things, or not liking the potential solutions they imagine. They often worry that one of the dogs will need rehoming, but they also worry about who'd take a dog with such a history of aggression, and they think that it will generalise to other dogs. So when I asked Fiona and John what their tipping point had been, it was that during a fight, Rita's eye had become badly damaged, so badly damaged that it needed to be removed. And that was when Fiona said enough was enough. She couldn't bear to think of Rita being so badly injured by Sue, because Rita had also got a lot of health problems, and putting her under general anaesthetic so many times was increasingly risky. She didn't want Rita to die on the operating table or for it to be impossible to treat her wounds. So enough was enough, and so they called me. So where do we go from here? When you have a 6-year fight history of such intensity, when fights are happening at least 2 or 3 times a day, when you've had 20 fight-related vet visits in the last year alone, is there any hope for reconciliation? And if you're not in this situation, how can you avoid things escalating to such a point? How can you recognise the things that dogs are likely to fight over? So in the next hour, I'm going to share their journey and that of many other dogs that I've worked with. I'm glad to tell you that there can be happily ever afters, and have been many of them. And there are also many things that we can do to make sure that things run smoothly in our home, so we never even get to that point in the first place. So you may be watching this thinking, but my dogs don't fight. But this is a really good way to ensure that that never happens. If I've not had the pleasure of your company before, welcome. I'm Emma and I work with dogs who have all the big feelings. Some of those live in the same home as each other as well. Most of my work involves dogs who have bitten, or dogs who are using aggressive behaviours in ways that put others, whether they're humans or their dogs, at risk. And many of the dogs that I work with are struggling with other dogs in the home. So from the small fluffs like Rita and Sue right up to the big old units who are struggling with each other, I'm often tasked with finding harmony in the home. Having been a trustee in a large French shelter for 6 years and having worked with dogs for over a decade, I've met a lot of dogs who are warring with another dog in the home. And although it's now just me and my dog Liddy, in the last 14 years, I've spent a lot of time with anywhere between 2 and 7 permanent residents. As a fosterer, that sometimes went up to 9 adult dogs and a bunch of fidgety puppies under my roof as well. So thankfully, squabbles have been few and far between, really. I can count them, but that's not a happy accident that's been the case. So I'm here to share with you some ways that you can reduce tension in your home as well. It's been so useful for me having lived with so many dogs, males and females, oldies and teenagers, and sometimes puppies as well, sterilised and intact, and to know what strategies can really make a difference. It's also been helpful for me to know when change is less possible or would be so stressful with no guarantee of success that permanent management strategies need to be put into place. So I'll talk you through the decision-making process that I often use with clients for that as well. In fact, thinking back on it, warring dogs within the home is actually why I started this educational journey in the first place. Up until 2013, the dogs I'd lived with had been pretty harmonious. It was only when I adopted my first dog from the shelter that things actually got really hairy. Unfortunately, I was relying on counsel from a so-called trainer whose expertise was so significantly lacking and whose education revolved around a few Cesar Millan books. I learned the hard way that qualifications and book learning actually matter, and I brought Amigo home, who you can see on the right there, as I've been told to do. I had him on the lead, I let Heston out of the house, and no surprise to me now that for an intact hormonal territorial adolescent male dog like Heston on the left, to find an intact adult male stranger on his turf caused an awful fight. I lived for 5 months in an atmosphere where fights simmered beneath the surface of almost everything we did. So much for that so-called trainer's advice that they needed to have one fight to sort out their pecking order, because their fights went on for months, low-level squabbles anyway. And that advice cost me a lot of money in vet bills and books and so on. But thankfully then, having started my own journey to resolve the problem, Amigo and Heston smoothed things over, and Amigo's last day, some 5 years later, this is my last photo of him, was spent cuddled up to Heston on the sofa together. So, what do we know about tensions in the home? And surprisingly little, to be honest. There's 2 studies that will look out about dog-to-dog aggression in the home, and we know a little bit more from free roaming dogs and the kind of problems that they experience. But because there was so little data, for a webinar that I presented back in 2020, I aggregated my last 50 in-home cases looking at troubled relationships with dogs. I usually have about 50 a year. And in the last 3 years, I've augmented that with another 100 cases where I've worked back through those case studies to pull out common scenarios, common factors where squabbles often happen. And as you'll see, dogs who behaved injuriously towards others in the home, sometimes even dogs who have killed other dogs, many may have actually pretty good relationships or very good relationships with other dogs in the home. Neither Rita nor Sue ever squabbled with Bob, for instance. And sometimes the only 2 dogs who are struggling are the only 2 dogs within the home, but other times they live within bigger groups where both the dogs who've been involved with a fight seem to get on fine with the other dogs in the home. It's often about that one specific relationship. So many times the dogs can be affable, they can be sociable with other dogs that they meet in public, although there are of course dogs who are anxious or choosy around other dogs, of course, or don't like unfamiliar dogs bouncing all over them. That's fine. There seems to be little correlation as well between dogs who get frustrated or aggressive with each other in the home and their response to other dogs that they meet. Many people think that things are about resources, and that can be true, but although resources often play a part, food and toys are actually more rare factors in the 150 cases I looked at. Perhaps that's just because we're really good at managing our dogs. We know that's a trigger point, so we manage them around food and chews or when they're playing with us. We will stray into behaviours like we might typically label resource guarding as we go on, but I've certainly found that there are many more common triggers than food bowls, toys or bed spaces. I'm assuming as well that we all have a common language already about what we class as aggressive behaviour in dogs, but I think it's important to clarify this. So Dr. Kendall Shepherd's ladder of aggression can be very useful, it's very well known, although dogs who've got a long history or who struggle with impulsivity or frustration may not exhibit those lower level, those green and yellow behaviours, what people might talk about as being appeasement signals, displacement behaviour or calming signals. I quite often think of the big 6 when I'm thinking of aggressive behaviour, and some of these are not on the ladder either. So the three of those big six are vocal behaviours, so we might think of growling, barking and snarling. And the other three I think of are hard stares or freezing, snapping and biting. That's my big six at the top. But we may also want to include other things like lunging, lip licking, head turns, and shoulder turns. I sometimes also include splitting, where a dog moves between a targeted dog and other individuals or the resource that they're trying to get to. For instance, if they're trying to get between the door and another dog, if the other dog wants to go out, or between the guardian and the dog. Many of these are just simple signs of emotional discomfort as well. For instance, lip licking, although they're often described as behaviours rooted in anxiety, which is not always true. Sometimes it can be frustration as much as it can be fear. Other behaviours can be attempts to reduce tension, like splitting, but it's often for that reason I just generally stick to the big six when I'm thinking about aggression between dogs in the home. Many of the people who end up using my services are very good evidence of a funnel effect, which I'll explain. So Dr. Ian Dunbar described 6 levels of aggression in dogs, which generally cover most situations, but not all. So level 1 includes the big 6 except biting. So it's 5 except biting, and it shouldn't include putting teeth on another dog. It is important to say at some point that these behaviours are ones that we often see in play, so it's important to know if dogs are playing or whether they're feeling quite uncomfortable with each other, and that's not really always very clear cut as you'd think, especially because some play behaviour might be attempts to diffuse a complicated emotional situation, and other play behaviour can sometimes spill out into aggression anyway. So level 1 sounds like it should be unproblematic. It's not, there's no biting, for instance. We might think of this as normal canine communication. Sometimes Ian Dunbar uses the word obnoxious behaviour, but it's not injurious behaviour on the whole, so there's no injuries. And sometimes there can be a whole lot of level 1 stuff that's actually being ignored. Level 1 might be very concerning for us if it's repeated or frequent, or if we're not very experienced with dogs, but it's often signs of good impulse control and frustration tolerance among the two dogs. And so we need to be mindful that we shouldn't push things too far and ignore constant low level behavior, this kind of level 1 behavior, and that maybe that's a really good time to start intervening. But at the same time, occasional level 1 behaviour, the occasional squabble, maybe 3 or 4 incidents over a year where we might be seeing growling or snapping from time to time. For me, that wouldn't necessarily be a big concern. But I know for some of the guardians that I've worked with, even a growl can, in what one growl a year can be just too much aggression for them to be able to cope with, and they don't think of that as a high standard of behaviour that they'd expect from their dogs. So that can be complicated, is sort of thinking of these behaviours as something that people have different opinions about. So level 2 means that teeth touch skin, but there was no scraping, there was no puncturing, and there was no laceration. So this should be pretty brief and momentary, and it won't involve a vet visit normally. So where trainer and behaviourist Jean Donaldson, she says that 99% of behaviour is level 1 or 2. I really agree with that. Most behaviour requires less medical attention than what we might think of as something that might happen in a kitchen accident. We'd see less injury with the dogs than we'd typically incur in the kitchen with accidental glass cuts or cuts on cans or knife edges when washing up, or minor burns from overexcited food removal from the oven. So these behaviours are really the kind of behaviours that don't need treatment from a medical perspective. But this is not to say that level 2 is not concerning. It can be very concerning when the dog's relied on really good impulse control and frustration tolerance. It can also be really concerning if dogs are relying on humans to do the management in this situation as well. I will say, in my 10 years with a large group of dogs in home, sometimes 17 dogs, including puppies, all but one of the fights I've ever seen, probably around 6 or so, I think, fights that I've seen in the home, all of them, bar one, have been level 1 or 2 activities. So really no injury, but they're things that I've wanted to kind of nip in the bud. Generally, these level 1 and level 2 fights often show really good prognosis because of what trainer and wise dog soul Suzanne Clothier calls the 3 Ps: provocation, proportion and persistence. Provocation means how much provocation was required to start the fight. Fights over trivial situations are much more concerning if it was a really trivial kind of thing, especially if they're really frequent. We can ask ourselves here, how much provocation did the dogs need to get into a fight? So thinking of my girl Tilly here in this photograph, she was a little food guarding, toy guarding spaniel. She gave bags of warning signals and growls to other dogs, all level 1 behaviour, and they always respected her and moved away. She never needed to move beyond the growl on most occasions because the other dogs listened. So for Tilly, that was very infrequent behaviour. The signals that she was giving were very clear and they were respected by the other dogs. So even though she didn't really need to guard the things, sometimes she felt a little bit more guardy. And that was information for me that she was feeling a bit more uncomfortable and I might need to manage the other dogs or the resources that she'd got. So really I was thinking that was she needed quite a significant amount of provocation to move beyond that growl. Tilly's behaviour is also a really good example of what Suzanne Clothier calls proportion. A growl to warn other dogs that you're nursing a bone, that's fair warning if they've ignored your hard stares and your grumbles. Proportionate behaviour is relatively good prognosis if we intervene effectively because it means the dogs have good impulse control and frustration tolerance, but it's not something we should let fester. It's really important that we don't push our luck with proportionate behaviour because luck always runs out. So if the dogs had a high level of provocation and the response was still proportionate, then it's not necessarily a concern. So one of my foster dogs, FL, you can see him at the back there behind Heston, he had a few man issues with my boy Heston. So although this was always sub-level 1 undercurrent, it was not even growls and hard stares. For most of the 18 months that they lived together, twice it did erupt into a fight, and those were level 2. Mostly because I'd not managed things as carefully as I might have done, as you'll see later, but both times FL bounced Heston in a doorway and both times FL submitted really quickly, especially considering he was much larger than Heston. Heston pinned FL to the floor for a few seconds, gave him a really good growling out. I don't even think it was level 2, I don't think teeth were involved. And it was all over before I even had time to react. Heston had been very provoked. Those 2 doorway fights were enough to take action, but both dogs' responses were proportionate. Now, you often think about the dog who was the attacker and their proportionate of behaviour. So I might be thinking about whether Heston's behaviour was proportionate in that situation. And I think being jostled through a doorway by an enormous, great big lurch of a dog is quite some provocation, especially because he tolerated a lot quite often when that was happening. But I also need to think about FL's response and whether his response was proportionate, and in that case he was in the wrong. He bounced past another dog, he jostled the other dog, he kept doing it, he didn't learn from that, and so his response to immediately submit and kind of be very apologetic about it and give out lots of appeasement signals afterwards and approach Heston very kind of warily and tentatively. But the problem was that FL didn't learn from that. He did it a couple of times, and so I needed to do some teaching because we can't always rely on management. So we really need to think that when we've got a lot of level 1 or level 2 incidents, 2 in 18 months is not a big deal really, but I really did need to help FL learn how to control his impulses about running through the door when other dogs were in the doorway. So they do suggest poor management, that's all on me, and risk progression if both of the dogs aren't behaving in a proportionate way. This brings us to Suzanne Clothier's third P, which is persistence. So both FL and Heston finished the fight before I'd even got time to get up and intervene. Neither dog persisted beyond a few seconds. Heston flattened FL, pinned him to the floor, growled at him. That was enough for FL to acquiesce immediately, and then they both got up and shook it off, and FL offered lots of appeasement behaviours. Persistence doesn't necessarily mean the duration of that single fight, though. It can also mean how many times is that scenario repeated. Clearly, it's not so good if the dogs keep getting into the same situation over and over and over again. So at some point there's going to be escalation, and that's what happened here. So although I can look at these 2 minor scraps between Heston and FL, they fit really within the realms of normal-ish dog behaviour. But FL wasn't learning from his behaviour not to push Heston to get through the door, and this was inevitable to cause a spark that would provoke Heston again in the future. So when dogs do get into these situations, we do need to think, okay, so what do I need to do to make sure that this doesn't happen again? So back to the Dunbar bite scale. Level 3 bites on the Dunbar bite scale are what we think of as breaking the skin bites. It might be a single bite, or there might be lacerations if there was a single bite and the other dog actually pulled away or was pulled away by a human. So here we might look at provocation and persistence. If the other dog persisted, and then it would be proportionate under the circumstances. Level 4 to 6 become progressively more serious and progressively less inhibited bites, less proportionate with less provocation but more persistence. So level 4 might be a single deep bite, particularly one without a release, or it may also involve shaking. A level 5 event will be multiple bites with repeated level 4 bites, and level 6 would involve the death of another animal. Level 6 is a bit complicated because sometimes they don't need to have shown a lot of behaviour to get there. So although the bulk, that 99% of aggression, will fall into the level 1 category, or perhaps sometimes level 2, it can still feel like the end of the world. We know and recognise growling and snapping as prequels to more dangerous or injurious behaviour at times, and we know to take it seriously. So of the remaining 1%, most of those are level 3 with occasional escalation, and it's very rare for me to work with a case where it's level 4 to 6. So when we think about dog-to-dog aggression, we also need to understand, though, that a single bite that doesn't even break the skin can be fatal if there's a size difference between these two. One is 45 kilos and one is 6. That would be a situation where it could potentially be fatal. I know of dogs who were in the 20+ range who inadvertently killed a smaller dog with one single quick bite that would have seemed proportionate to another dog. Just as I know some big old fluffs who knocked 7 bells out of each other for over half an hour before they could be safely separated and didn't even have a wound. Much will depend as well on where the bite goes. Neck bites aren't so bad if you've got a good ruff and a lot of loose skin, but not so good if you've got tight skin and not so much of a fur there. And some others can be like an ear bite, can get infected and then require amputation of the ear, like it happened with Rita and Sue. So it's not always related to severity in terms of how much injury is caused and how much the cost is at the vet. And so we do always need to remember that context matters. And it's not also about the physical wound all the time, is it? So I remember taking Amigo to my lovely French monsieur of a vet towards the end of the vet's career, actually. I think that made him a little wise, as you can tell. I was convinced that Amigo was broken. I'd broken my dog, but there were no wounds. It was level 2 all the way, no bruising even, but Amigo was limping and he was very subdued, and I was convinced I'd broken my dog. Madame, my vet said with his best Frenchman non-scientific explanation I have ever heard, Madame, he is a man. It is not his body that is injured, it is his pride. And don't even get me started on the whole dogs having pride thing, but he was right in one important respect. There was no physical injury, and the injuries were different than something that was happening within his body. So what can we learn? The first thing is that we've actually got very little evidence to go off from the world of other canine species and infighting within the group. So only wolves out of all the canid species actually live from time to time in larger groups, and outside of zoos and research facilities they're usually related wolves. An intruder into the territory is likely to be killed. Some studies estimate that the biggest killer of wolves after humans is other wolves. Wolves also disperse at maturity quite often if they live that long, and this prevents inbreeding, but it also keeps the equilibrium between resources and territory without stressing that delicate ecosystem of the family too far. So what we do know about wolves is based on modern wolf behaviour as well. Wolves in North America are more likely to live in bigger groups, partly because they can, but partly because teamwork is necessary to kill much larger prey species like they have in the United States. Wolves in Europe, on the other hand, live in much smaller groups, and it doesn't take a crack squad of 5 adult wolves working together to kill wild boar or to kill a mountain goat. So European wolves live in much smaller groups. That's often the breeding pair and maybe a couple of juveniles or sub-adult wolves who will then disperse as they get older to find their own mates and to find their own territories and to find their own resources. So wolf behaviour doesn't tell us very much. Dispersal is sometimes that's a behaviour that we see also in free-ranging dogs who make it to adulthood too. And remember that only 20% of animals estimated may do that. There's some evidence of related females hanging around together to raise offspring communally, like sisters or mother and daughter. But the very small number of free roaming individuals who make it to adulthood, they'll usually disperse. So conflict between wolves and dogs who live together in groups is actually often between other groups, and in the group is various stages of ritualized aggression. Male free roaming dogs are more likely to get into disputes based on territory with dogs that they don't know, and maybe with mating rights, where female dogs are more likely, from the very limited studies that exist, to get into disputes protecting their litter or over food resources. So the kind of things that we would expect, but very few free ranging dogs live in the kind of environment that we see with dogs in the home. And that means we don't actually have that much data. Other species of canids, such as jackals and coyotes, tend to only stay in groups based around the breeding pair, maybe one or two older surviving related offspring until they disperse. So it's actually really hard to know how other canid species would behave in a group of unrelated animals. There are only wolves and free-ranging dogs who tend to form larger groups anyway, and groups of unrelated individuals are very unusual, although with limited DNA data we don't actually really know if they're related or not. And we can only go really off observational data from studies so far. That means there's not actually that much data related to dogs on how they could behave or should behave when they are left to their own devices, especially in non-family settings and especially within the confines of a family home. So while we do have those small groups of related family members for free-ranging dogs and wolves, what we know about aggression within the group, who stay within the group, is that much of that aggression is ritualized. You've got to have some excellent inhibitory skills going on to keep the peace in social groups. Only in artificial confines do free-ranging dogs and wolves come together in larger and non-related groups, and their patience is much more stretched, particularly if the dogs or wolves are not sterilised or castrated. And often those confined groups, often in zoos and research facilities, have to be split up from each other, and more frequently with dogs than wolves. Those groups, however, do not have humans living with them often to help management and to keep the peace, so that although they give us some data, the dogs in our home are very different for many reasons, and not least because our homes are smaller and it's more confined, but also because we're there intervening, sometimes for good reasons and sometimes with bad outcomes. That means, though, that really it's only data about dogs in our homes that we can rely on as useful information. Dogs just don't live in those ways in other environments. But sadly, we're actually reliant on very limited science and on individual case studies as we think about aggression between dogs who live in the home and conflict there. It's even more limited when we take out teething problems of the kind we may get when we exclude dogs who've been rehomed in adulthood from that data. Dogs like Amigo and Heston, for instance. There's actually a dearth of information about other dogs who live in unrestrained and unrestricted groups outside of the human sphere, about how they behave together in family groups. And in many ways, we may ask how relevant that information would be if we could get that information, since a lot of the frustration we find between dogs who live together relates to our way of living with dogs who may not have chosen to live together and are unable to disperse if things go wrong. And what we do know is if there is conflict in free-ranging groups of dogs who are living on the streets, for instance, or in villages, one dog will usually disperse, at least for part of the day. Dogs in the home don't have that choice, so where free-ranging dogs may be brought together by food resources or affected by limited nature of resources, which may cause squabbles, and whose lives may actually and relationships may be transient and brief, this data may not have very much to contribute to our understanding of our in-home captive companions whose morphology and behavioural patterns have been modified by artificial selection, whose hormones are modified by sterilisation or not, whose lives are restrained, whose caregivers interfere in their relationships, and where relationships between two may be expected to last for a decade or more. You don't get that on the streets. I don't think it needs saying that dogs living on the periphery of human society do not have pair bonds that last that long by and large. Where research data is gathered about about aggression towards other dogs in home environments, usually that data doesn't specify whether the target is a known dog or an unfamiliar dog, as well as the length of their relationship. And that matters. As well as that, the ethics of collecting data on aggression between dogs is also tough, like can't set up experimental situations. It's not as if you can kind of set up conflicting situations and see how the dogs handle it. Most data as well is collected post-incident, as I'll be sharing with you today, and memory affects that. But we can't just set up situations, strike a match and stand back and see what happens. It's also sometimes difficult to understand the onset, the causes, the various stimuli that are involved, because we're working with people's recollections, which are affected by memory, by attention, by importance, by cognitive biases, by all of the things that we remember that didn't happen and all the things that we forget that actually did. So what do we know? I'm going to share with you information, the findings from two studies. The first is Sherman, Reisner, Taliaferro and Hout in 1996. Two really big names there in canine behaviour, Ilana Reisner and Catherine Hout. They looked at 99 case studies from 1983 to 1993. So they didn't discriminate between dogs who'd just been put together, like Amigo and Heston, and dogs who'd lived together for longer, but most of their findings will resonate with what I'm going to discuss further, particularly one trigger that they found in these cases that they categorised as excitement, where 51 of the 73 dogs who fought in the home did so in whatever we might unpick from that word excitement. I think that was my most significant takeaway from this paper. The other study is a 2011 paper from Rubel, Moon, Fanelli, Menander and Dodman. And again, we've got two names there with whom you might already be familiar, one of whom is Alice Moon Fanelli and Dr. Nick Dodman is the other. So they looked at 38 case studies that came to the behaviour clinic in a year. But really though, these two studies are what we have to work with when we're thinking about aggression in the home, evidence-wise. So what else do these two studies tell us? So Sherman and colleagues found breed links in their 73 cases, where they found toy breeds and gun dogs were less likely to engage in household conflict and herding and working breeds more likely. Does this maybe tell us something about impulsivity and impulse control differences between breeds? I don't know. Maybe frustration tolerance in breeds? I don't know. It's hard to know. We need more data than that. But when I looked at my last 150 cases over the last 5 years or so, it's not really evidenced in those cases. I've not noticed a pattern where some dog breeds are overrepresented or some groups are. Japanese Chin, Lhasa Apso, Bichons, Yorkies, Frenchies can be as likely to get in fights in the home as Collies, Shepherds, Rottweilers, Spaniels and so on. Sherman and colleagues found same-sex pairings to be more likely, with females involved in in-home scraps. They also found that of the 42 of the 73 instigators, they were younger. The average age was about 4.2. So these are not babies who are having teenage problems, prefrontal inhibition problems. I didn't find same-sex pairings more likely. I found them to be the rule. So of my 150 cases, I didn't have one single case where there were male-female squabbles that were difficult to resolve, not one single case. And what I also noticed that it was pretty evenly split between males and females. So that's the Sherman study. The second study, which was Rubel and colleagues, that really consolidated those early findings from 83 to 93, bar 1 or 2 points. So that study differentiated helpfully between the age of onset and the date of arrival at the behaviour clinic, because those two things are not always the same. Because the first fight is not always the one that sends people in search of a behaviour consultant. Their average age was 36 months, so right on the cusp of social maturity for many dogs. And they also found that the younger dog was more often the instigator. The late onset of aggression may suggest that social maturity is a key factor rather than sexual maturity, and we can't really take anything from this about the dog's frustration skills or impulsivity skills, so there was a lot of data that we really could do with in those studies that we just don't get hold of. So, however, Rubel and colleagues also found that most of their cases, those 38 cases, were triggered by guardian attention and then by food and then by what they called excitement. And I would call anticipation of rewarding events or frustration. So we've got rewards at stake. Therefore, I think it's fair to say that if we're dealing with problematic dynamics in a multi-dog household, we should also ask about how well all the dogs, not just the ones exhibiting problems, cope with frustration, and how impulsive these dogs are in general. Quite often when I've done this, I found one highly impulsive dog, often a teenager, and one dog with lower frustration tolerance, often the older dog, and the other dogs are just coping really well with a cuckoo in the nest because they're really, really tolerant. So although these two studies are helpful, I don't think they tell us the whole story, and I think there's much more we can understand. So in my own case studies, I found much more nuance and some larger patterns than these two studies which did not consider these. So the first one that we've hinted at, is the role of hormones. So as I said, I didn't have one single case where female dogs and male dogs were engaged in prolonged fighting or disputes. Might have a little squabble, but usually level one and not the kind of thing that would get to me. We often hear anecdotally that female dogs hold grudges against each other, or that there's less chance of reconciliation with female dogs who fought, a bit like Rita and Sue. But in my case studies, it was about the same. Some male dogs also struggled to reconcile in the long run as well, and the outcome, whether it was successful or not, whether one of the dogs had to live separately or whether one of the dogs had to be rehomed, wasn't really clearly split between females and males. So I couldn't see any evidence that female dogs held grudges, or it was more difficult to reconcile female dogs who'd fought. In the last 10 years, we're moving to perhaps more conscientious sterilisation practices, and we're often waiting longer to sterilise dogs so that it doesn't impact on their growth hormones, or we're even leaving dogs intact most of their lives without always considering how complicated that can be for the dogs. So although I've lived with groups of dogs where there's been more than one uncastrated male around an in-season female, I confess that it really hadn't crossed my tiny mind that introducing female hormones to the equation caused a lot of male dogs frustration. Yet in the laboratory, for researchers who are studying frustration and aggression, one of the best ways to artificially create a frustrating situation is in keeping an intact male separate from an in-season female, and then you introduce a male rival into the first male's territory. So while some intact male dogs may seem to simply be a little bit more attentive to in-season females, others can be driven wild by it. So I never bothered Heston or some of my other male dogs that I've had that were not castrated, but it did bother other dogs who were there. So we do need to consider the fact, though, that if we've essentially got two competing males who are unable to mate with a female, then we may find that they are struggling and we are getting frustrated behaviour and redirection. So one of the good examples of this is the Wolf Science Centre that's part of the veterinary university in the University of Vienna, where they keep a number of dogs who have been vasectomized. So they've still got all of their hormones, and the female dogs are intact. And what they found was that for the dogs in particular, the wolves coped okay with that scenario, but the dogs didn't. And what they found, that the dogs often had to be split up because the fighting became so severe. So we really do need to think more carefully about the hormones, because some dogs are going to cope with that absolutely fine. Like I said, I had absolutely no problem. Occasionally I used to call Toby my walking womb detector, because he would be very interested in female dogs who came in, whether they were sterilised or not sterilised. And if they were in season, then he was very interested in them and had quite a lot of frustrated behaviours. But my other male dogs left him alone, and my female dogs left him alone as well, and there was no humping or no redirection onto anyone else. He was just a little bit more awake and alert than normal, and certainly more interested in the girls. So there was no conflict there, but certainly in the last 2 years I've noticed a slight uptick. It's not huge, when a female dog in the household comes into season and two male dogs who are being kept separate from that female then start to redirect onto each other, and we start to see some problems there. So some dogs, as we know, some intact male dogs do not cope well with the smell of intact male dogs in their territory and find that very difficult. and some dogs may cope with that better. So it's not kind of cut and dry. It's not like hormones drive dogs into lunacy, but at the same time, I am seeing more hormonal related cases, particularly around the female coming into season within the home. Another thing that we've become more conscious of in the last 20 years since those two studies is the role of health. So I noticed, for instance, that as my girl Tilly, her diabetes became progressively less manageable and she got other aches and pains. She was slower to eat. She wanted to eat. She had the appetite, but she didn't have the will. And she was less tolerant of dogs moving around her, even if they weren't directly approaching her food bowl. It's not unusual for dogs who are in poor health to have less tolerance than usual, or conversely, to have an improvement and then to be more assertive than usual. So I remember a case with two male dogs who were fighting within the home, very much fitting the patterns that we've already seen. But around a year after their initial squabbles, the older dog's health suddenly declined very quickly. So things were resolved. They had a really good year, and then the older dog just died very, very quickly. And it became apparent that he'd been living with cancer for some time, probably that whole year. Sometimes these are changes that other dogs might pick up on, but we don't see that until much later. So one thing that I sometimes noticed in larger groups was that the two who were fighting were not the dogs in poor health, but their fights sometimes correlated with the decline of health of an older dog, usually a female actually, who had quite often been involved in keeping the peace. So sometimes what would happen was an older female dog would become ill, and then there would certainly be squabbles between some of the younger dogs. And it's not necessarily thinking about who's going to rise up through the pecking order or so on and overtake her and overthrow her. We're not talking about chickens here, but sometimes where that older dog has been involved in managing the behaviour or helping soothe things and calm things down and help the group become more stable and offering more affiliative behaviours, when that stops because the older dog is in poor health, then sometimes I think fights are more likely to break out as well. So that's a pattern that I'd noticed. So in my 150 cases, I noticed that there were two other important complicating factors. The first is related to the sexual maturity of the younger dog, what Ian Dunbar calls losing the puppy license. So these dogs were often between 6 to 9 months. They were as fizzy as you'd usually expect a younger dog to be, and the instigator of the fight was usually the older dog, and usually they were somewhere between 2 and 4 years old, but sometimes as old as 8 or 10. Certainly it was not the case, though, of a geriatric dog not being able to tolerate a puppy. So these cases were all same sex. There was often a trigger, like anticipating something good, which brought the dogs together into the same space as each other, where the younger dog had got poor impulse control, and in these cases the older dog would often seem to snap. It came out of the blue and attack the younger dog, and often cause very severe damage and lots of level 3, level 4 and even level 5. The younger dog was almost always the target rather than the instigator. There was usually a frustrating moment involved, like the imminent arrival home of a family member. Often the car had pulled up on the drive and the dogs were drawn together by the door. So these happen in doorways, hallways, gates, and the dogs are drawn together. The older dog would usually grab and pin the younger dog, sometimes causing significant injuries to the face, the ears, the front legs, or the eyes or the neck. What I'd really think of is an older dog just kind of saying, you behave better than this. The other pattern I noticed, though, was one of that the two studies also noticed that around 2 to 4 years, the younger dog arrived at social maturity, not sexual maturity. They were often the instigator in this case, under significant provocation, prolonged provocation from the older dog. And the older dog in these cases often came off worse injury-wise. So often the younger dog had been policed or blocked from behaving by the older dog. And again, there were moments of excitement, anticipation, frustration in places where the dogs would be drawn together. And it seemed as if the younger dog almost said at that point, enough is enough, stop policing me. And here the older dog was often injured, and again there were a lot of injuries to the face, the ears, the front paws, the head, neck or torso. So in this photograph, what had happened were there were two older terriers, female terriers who lived in the house, and a young female German Shepherd, and the two older terrier sisters, I think they were 11 and 12, used to patrol the German Shepherd, the younger female German Shepherd, who was about 18 months old. And she used to get very excited, as many German Shepherds do, by cars and things going past. So she would run up and down in the conservatory as she could see the cars driving up the road. And what we saw was that the terriers had often been involved in trying to police that behaviour and interrupt the German Shepherd and stop that behaviour from happening. And what had happened was, because the terrier moved always towards the German Shepherd, it got to the point that even though they'd been doing it for almost 18 months, that one day the German Shepherd just said, no, I've had enough. And this was the result of that incident there. And again, these are dogs who then went on to live fine, but needed some specific help in how they overcame and how we reconciliated them afterwards. Reconciliated, is that a word? Is it not reconciled? But this helped me see, though, that there were often two factors. The first was a delayed reward, or a reward that was behind a barrier. Sometimes that could be food, but often it was human attention. So the barrier could also be something like a lead, something that restricted the dog's movement. So we've often got a very frustrating scenario. And many times that's often when there was somebody coming into the house where the dogs were very excited by guests, sometimes the arrival of a family member or even a cat or another dog. But doors, gates, leads, windows were often involved. Some dogs, for instance, had got a history of redirecting onto one another when waiting to get into the car or go through a gate, and that was often a provoking situation in which something bad really happened, that frustrating trigger, if you like. And I call these flashpoints. It's a moment where there's an event, something's going on, and the dogs are anticipating good stuff will happen in one location. And there can also be those moments where there's changes of energy, something happens, a trigger that changes the behaviour of the dogs in that moment, and that often combines with what we'll see next. So what we see next is a second factor, which I call the hotspot. So flashpoints and hotspots often happen together. So the trigger usually occurs in a specific location where the dogs are drawn together, like the conservatory windows with the German Shepherd and the terriers. And that can be entranceways, doorways, small spaces. And the place that acts as an inadvertent hotspot, suddenly they wouldn't normally be together. And what happens is the dogs are almost corralled into that place, like a gate or a corridor or a pathway. And the flashpoints and hotspots together make for very poor combinations that are often involved in a lot of those initial fights happening. And sometimes one or more of the dogs are frustrated by something that's happening on the other side of a window, a gate, a barrier, a door. They don't have to be, good feelings of rewards. They could also be things like strangers passing the home, birds passing outside the window, or the cars for the German Shepherd. One dog gets very frustrated, and their behaviour or vocalisation draws the other dog into their space, sometimes to manage their behaviour and other times just to join in, and then sometimes that fight will break out. So we certainly saw that with Rita and Sue, for instance, on walks, where the appearance of a strange, welcoming human bending down to give the dogs attention drew them both together towards the human. So there was a reward there, the human attention, and a flashpoint, and they're in a hotspot, and then a fight would break out at that place. So then when we think about our flashpoints and our hotspots, if we add one or more of the following, so same sex, hormones, health, or those two periods, sexual maturity and social maturity, when we add those into the mix, and it makes it much more likely that a fight would occur, especially if one or more of the dogs had got poor impulse tolerance, or poor impulse control, or poor frustration tolerance. Other situations that didn't often involve flashpoints and hotspots were squabbles over potential threat of losing a valued resource, or a prize activity that would be curtailed or diluted by the arrival of the other dog. So where Rita had got all of her guardian's attention and strokes, 100% attention on her, the arrival of Sue meant this undivided attention would be divided. So this could also involve things like play or games, but simple things like training sessions. I've known dogs get upset that another dog was being trained and not them. Even things like grooming sessions where the human was interacting with the dog, but also the dogs had to exercise self-restraint, and it got the harder for them to inhibit their own responses. So sometimes throughout the day, the more and more of these situations that we would see, we could think of that almost as trigger stacking, that this could be very frustrating for the dog, and then a fight would break out. Sometimes this could actually be about the attention of another dog as well. So I've certainly known dogs who enjoyed playing with another dog and then found it very offensive that another dog turned up to kind of join in, and they had that risk that the attention that they'd been getting, the interactions that they'd been having with the other dog, their play sessions would be diluted, and so the arrival of another dog then became a threat to them. And where these happen progressively over the day, and the dog is constantly being asked to share, then we might find that these are often fights that culminate in the evening when the older dog or the other dog has just lost some of that tolerance that they've used up all of their self-control throughout the day. So when we're thinking about harmony in the home, our main job is to understand hotspots, flashpoints, and those other risk factors. And then we can manage them a little bit better. But we also need to understand, however, that management in itself can contribute to frustration as well as helping to manage challenges. So we need management, but it can be frustrating. Management, things like crates, leads, baby gates, tethers, often fail because of human error. So for instance, we might find that we've been keeping our two males separate so that they don't war over our in-season female, only to find that human error contributes to the dogs getting out and getting into a fight. Carrying out a frustration assessment and impulse control audit can also really help. It's something that I would do in all cases. Our dog who tolerates frustration very poorly may actually be the victim as well. So sometimes it feels a bit weird to focus on the wrong dog in inverted commas and do training with the dog who'd been attacked. Giving them skills to help manage their body and their frustration levels can help, though, reduce the likelihood of a fight. So when we remember that frustration is often the mother of invention and the dark side of highly motivated behaviour, I just said that human error can contribute to the failure of management strategies like pens and crates and gates and doors, but it can also fuel inventiveness and persistence around getting out. And it's not unknown for a highly motivated dog to find inventive ways to bypass our attempts to manage them and keep them safe. I used to think that management was always benign. It isn't benign. It can even contribute to the frustration of the situation. And management also doesn't change how the dogs feel about each other either, or teach them how to cope. So it's another reason to carry out a frustration assessment and impulse control audit, because management is really important to stop these situations happening in the first place, but it can also contribute to frustration and can cause worsening of the situation. And besides understanding hotspots and flashpoint, as well as those other risk factors, and managing and helping to build competency, so modifying a behaviour in handling frustration and impulsivity, it can also really help to teach our dogs what we want them to do instead around hotspots and flashpoints. So helping them build frustration tolerance and impulse control skills can definitely help, usually in both dogs. Putting management into place and building up the dog's ability to cope with management is also really important. Giving them other things to focus on, but also teaching them how to regulate better. I've known, for instance, dogs to be put away into a crate when guests arrived, given a food toy or something to keep them busy, only to fight when they were released because neither had actually finished their food, and that just gave them more resources to fight over and stoke their arousal levels in the first place. In other words, we can't simply rely on management. Living with warring dogs is not easy. A behaviour consultant can definitely help, but make sure you work with somebody who's got experience of resolving cases like this. So if you see that they've got warring dogs of their own, it's not necessarily a bad thing. I've had warring dogs of my own who lived apart. It's absolutely fine. I certainly understand how you feel, but ask for resolution. So I lived with Liddy and Flicker, for instance, for 10 months, and they were never integrated. They met once. They lived completely separate lives because Liddy cannot tolerate female dogs and Flicker was 15 years old. So it was fine to manage them for that amount of time. But I did have to teach both of them how to cope whenever they were shut away from me in home. So both like my company, what can I say? I'm Ace and I smell of dog biscuits. But I didn't just bang doors and gates into the equation and hope that they would cope. But Liddy's relationship with male dogs was sometimes fractious, and it was my job to make sure that she did not bully Heston and block him from getting to me. My attention is very important when another dog is accessing it, and at other times she just doesn't care. And to make sure that she wasn't getting distressed when Heston was getting my affection and she wasn't. So realistic resolution, successful integration is something I'll always look for, but I would be looking for a specialist in in-house squabbles too, just as I'd seek out a family therapist if the family is squabbling, rather than just a more general therapist or even a teacher or a doctor. It is a very special problem. Any trainer that uses punishment or correction, it goes without saying, needs avoiding completely. Dogs are too contextual to generalise to times that you're not there, and it lulls us into thinking the problem is resolved only for it to happen when we're not present. It's also imperative that the behaviour consultant also takes into account human behaviour. I can't tell you how often the human side of the equation actually stoked the fires rather than resolving things. So just 2 examples of the last thing about why I wouldn't use punishment. For instance, I started working with it was a family of 5 all male spaniels. 2 of the spaniels had started having quite frequent fights, and a trainer had recommended that the guardian used a shock collar. So the dog who's the instigator of the fights had the shock collar on, and the guardians would be pressing the shock because it always happened when they were present. However, then what the dogs then started to understand was that the shock only happened when the guardians were present and they could press the remote, and so then started to have fights when the guardians were not present, and that's where the situation got really, really bad, because previously they'd not even been fighting when the guardians present were not present. So 2 things from that case helped me really understand that punishment doesn't change anything, it just suppresses the behaviour, and so it's really important that we don't do that, particularly if that's only happening when we're present. But guardian attention and guardian interaction often changes things. It stokes the fire of arousal sometimes, or causes excitement. I can't tell you how many fights were caused by a guardian coming home and the car pulling up on the driveway, and then all hell broke loose because all the dogs were really excited to see whoever it was who'd come home. So sometimes we need to also rule out what happens if the dogs are not fighting when we're not there, and in that case video can be really useful. So sometimes it's just we're the additional thing that just tips the dogs over into having a fight. Sometimes we're the cause in ourselves, that we're inviting dogs into our space and we don't understand that the dogs are not necessarily got a good relationship in the first place. So sometimes we can be the trigger, sometimes we can be just a simple contributing factor, and that's really important if we were starting to think about using punishment or corrections or telling the dogs off, because the dogs will understand, because dogs are very contextual, that punishment is only occurring when we're there, and that's when fights then start to break out into situations where we're not there. So this webinar was called Harmony in the Home, but understanding these common factors behind those disputes in the home makes such a difference about how we live with our dogs. It creates harmony. But once we understand them, it does make it much easier to avoid conflict in the first place, and to manage it better, and to help the dog cope better. For Rita and Sue, they had a tailored program of reintegration to help them learn how to cope with each other again. I won't tell you it was a quick and simple fix. It took 18 months for them to be fully reintegrated, but it is possible for dogs to go on and live a much happier life where management is reduced periodically over time. It also goes without saying that prevention is worth its weight in gold, and once we know those significant risks, then we can work out how to reduce them before they even become a problem. Thanks so much for joining me. I hope that it has been helpful to understand why dogs in the home often end up without harmony in the first place. Once we know the risks, then we know how to avoid those risks in the first place, teaching dogs the skills that they need to manage their relationships rather than relying on management alone. And that way we can all live harmoniously together where flashpoints and hotspots are present and present no bother to us at all.